First of all, let me ask, James, how did you get into business? How did you get into this business of being a curator, museum hotshot?
Well, I think the question you're asking is how did I come to learn to love history? Mm-hmm. And I don't know how many of you had the same experience I did in grade school studying history. It was the most loathsome, boring, horrible subject. It was all learning dates and names that you couldn't pronounce and people you didn't care about, and none of it seemed relevant at all. I first came to Chautauqua as a kid. I studied here. I was a summer student and studied with Remington Arthur. Anybody remember Remington Arthur? That was his name.
Yeah.
And but I came to love history through art history. And basically, when I went through museums, like the Cleveland Museum of Art, and I'd see these huge paintings and kind of giant European allegorical paintings. And I mean, I didn't know what any of it meant. I grew up in Northeast in the grape vineyards, But somehow I was captivated by what I saw. I am an artist. I went to Rhode Island School of Design, and I've really spent my life basically in design, essentially, which is some kind of way that I can contribute to the field. But it was really learning to read biography that opened history up to me. That somehow led to psychology. Then suddenly it all started to click. And then, when a good history teacher, I think, can make it seem relevant to the child, that it's difficult. How many of you had one good English teacher that you can remember? I know I did, yeah. And one is just about as many as you get. But anyway, so that's how I came to it. I moved here 10 years ago in September. I grew up in Northeast, which is about 15 miles away, but I've lived all over the country. And when my mom died, I was with her in Florida. And at that point, I could go anywhere I wanted, so I came back to the vineyards. Because I think if you grow up in the vineyards, you think it's normal. I know, but, and Lake Erie, but, for all the world, like, I don't know, the Riviera, poor man's Riviera.
Joni,
so anyway.
I'm sorry, I was going to ask the same question to Joni.
Yeah.
Well, I started out as a bookkeeper, actually, at the History Center, and moved into the position that I have now because I knew we had to keep going in the financial way we were going, get stronger. But I've learned to love our local history, and it's about teaching, it's about comparing and contrasting what's happening now and then, and putting it in context with now, so that people now understand. Everyone has to eat, everyone has to live somewhere, everyone has to pay bills, usually. Everyone lives their life the same way through time, it's just they do it in a different manner. And so teaching that with the personal stories is really what's neat about history.
When did you start at the Fenton History Center?
2001.
Okay, I started around the same time at the McClurg Museum, so we're both newbies.
Yeah, we're newbies. We're newbies. And no one else is doing what we do at this level in this county. Chautauqua saves their history through, and you have John, and that's a wonderful asset for you. There's not too many other historical societies that are saving things at the level that we're working on at Fenton. And it's like a child. When it's gone, it's gone. You cannot get it back. And so you don't have any time to do anything over again. So it's very important.
Talk to me about the selection process when you do exhibits, and just generally, how do you go through that process, and then we'll get specifically to Torche. I'll use Joni, you can start. How do you select that?
Well, usually you find something that excites you. Here's an example. In the past, in museums, when a curator ran into something that excited them, they would do an exhibit about it. We actually had someone who thought that they should do an exhibit. Don't get me wrong, it's a great idea if you have the right artifacts, but they wanted to do an exhibit on christening gowns because someone had given us 2 christening gowns. Who wants to see that? I wasn't too interested in that. So we talk, you find somebody that the community's interested in. And a good example is last year we did Satan's Bowl of Death. And it came, let me explain. And it came up because we are doing articles in the paper every week, pretty much, about artifacts from the collection. And it was February, and NASCAR starts in February. You always have to compare and contrast what's going on in people's lives. Well, NASCAR is a big deal around here. So we decided to do something about auto racing in our area. And we had one artifact about Satan's Bowl of Death dirt track racing, jalopy racing. And it was a sign that said, Satan's Bowl of Death every Sunday afternoon in Bust So we put that in the paper. We were run over with phone, no pun intended, run over with phone calls about this subject. And by the time the exhibit went up in June, and this is in February, by the time it went up in June, we had 3 full sets, 3 full collections of photographs. We had a list of drivers as long as your arm. You know how it's happened with your rollerboat project. All of a sudden, the information just comes out of the woodwork. And so that is a wonderful way to start an exhibit from a grassroots perspective. What does your community want to know about? Not what trips your trigger. What does your community want to know about? And doing the same sort of thing right now with the big bands in Chautauqua County. And that'll open on Saturday. It's been very soft right now because I want to make sure it's done right before I tell everybody it's there. But it started with 10 posters we found from Chautauqua, the casino in Bemis Point, and the Pier Ballroom in Run Park. And I have these 10 posters, and they have all kinds of great names on them, like Benny Goodman and a few others, Ishan Jones and Bunny Berrigan, and some other names you may not know, but they're pretty
Try this crowd.
Yeah, that's
Who are you kidding?
That's true. They're wonderful. I've been doing a lot of research. I listened to a lot of great music. And then I got a phone call from Stu Snyder, who's 91 years old and has had a big band for years and years and years. For his real job, he's painted signs. But Stu and I got together a few times. I've got his photo collection. I've even got his music converted to a CD now, and that'll play in the exhibit. But there's a lot of other things that are going on in the exhibit. But the point is, it comes out of the community. Was the community interested in? Because we put an article in about a scary trumpet that was in the big band era. That's where I think exhibits matter. What does your community want to know about? And what can you gather from your community? Because we need to get that information.
Something similar happened. A couple of years ago, we did an exhibition we're at the Maritime Museum in Erie, and it was on the ice harvesting industry. Of course, Lake Chautauqua, Chautauqua Lake was famous for the ice and had several large industries. But I sent a first-class letter to all of our members and asked them if they remembered anything from their childhood in the time before refrigeration. And I just got an incredible response, not only from our members, but from family members and friends of members from all over the country. So that touched a nerve, and I was really thrilled to get the response, and then I put them all in the newsletter.
Yeah, I had a gentleman call me from Chicago about the big band, and he'd done a study on the casino in Bemis and everything that came through there. Yeah. So it was pretty tight. It's like 1938 to 1942.
It's always a good idea to test your assumptions. To get some sort of community feedback.
Yep.
Is the community interested in this program? And if they are, then there's a good chance they'll support it. If they're not, they won't.
Just one suggestion I'll give to you is the Temple Hesed Abraham Sports Hall of Fame dinners they used to have in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where they have virtually every big-name sports person roll in here in the end of January. And there is a load of pictures and autographs and stuff.
At the Sports Hall of Fame?
Way before the Chautauqua Sports Hall of
Oh,
Fame.
I know, but where is that information at?
Probably private hands. This is one of these things you're going to have to put an article together.
Yeah.
And Cy Goldman and Mike Goldman and stuff. And somebody wrote in a paper on it not too long ago, Frank Hyde's son.
Okay.
Anyways, we digress.
Yeah.
Albion Tourget. Albion Tourget. We know there's a plaque as you go up towards the courthouse from here. It says home of Albion Tourget. We know there's obelisk in the cemetery.
Yes, exactly.
And probably most people, until you did this exhibit and beat the drum, didn't know much more about that.
I've never heard of them. How many of you knew anything about Tourget? How many of you know anything about Tourget as we speak? A few of you.
How
not
many
too
of you
many.
have to say his name?
Yeah. Well, when I got on board at the McClurg Museum, I came to realize that that we had an incredible collection called the Tourget collection, which didn't mean a thing to me. although I knew it was very big. It was over 11,000 items, and very important because it was heavily researched, and we would get several calls, several times a year, basically researchers, scholars, humanitarians who were interested in, knowing more about Tourget. And so I guess it was about a year ago, maybe a little more, I decided to apply for a grant from the New York Council for the Humanities to mount an exhibit that would explore the Tourget collection. And what I had in mind basically was to contact a biographer named Mark Elliott. I've passed out copies of this little brief biography that was put together as basically an exhibit guide for the Tourget exhibit that's at the Jackson Center. Mark Elliott wrote the copy. It's an abbreviated biography of Tourget, and it was paid for by the Delmas Foundation in Manhattan. So I sent off a letter of inquiry to the Humanities Council, and fleshed out the idea, thought some more about it, asked Mark if he would be interested in doing it, asked Joni if she'd be interested in participating, contacted the Jackson Center because I thought what a beautiful venue that would be to, with their newly refreshed archives room and exhibit area, and with an auditorium that would be a terrific place to do a symposium. I'd never done a symposium before. And anyway, so I heard about 6 months later from the Humanities Council that they were going to fund it. And so I was thrilled, and of course then it meant we had to get to work. Mark Elliott had written a book, and I think it's called Colorblind Justice, Albion Tourget and whatever it is. Tourget is most famous to those who study the Civil War, as the author of A Fool's Errand by One of the Fools, which was a bestseller. It was published anonymously in the 1870s. And it was kind of a history of Reconstruction from his own point of view. Tourget was born near Kingsville, Ohio, which is in Ashtabula County, which isn't too far from here. The family was French Huguenot. They came here from New England. They settled in northern Ohio. They were farmers. And Tourget was their only son. His mother died when he was still a boy. And he went to Kingsville Academy, wanted to go to Harvard, wanted to become a lawyer, could only afford to go to the University of Rochester. And then the Civil War broke out. Anyway, so he had this remarkable life. He was a Civil War veteran. He did become a lawyer. He moved to North Carolina after the war and became a judge, practiced law there, helped write the state constitution, and got in trouble with Ku Klux Klan. He befriended freed slaves and helped to educate them. He adopted a girl named Petrillo, I believe her name was, sent her to school. He was a remarkable person. But aside from the books that he published after his period in North Carolina, he's most known for Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a Supreme Court case, the first one brought to challenge segregation in the United States. And who's familiar with Plessy, the lawyers in the room, I'm sure. Everybody has to study it. I have a brother who's a lawyer and a sister who's a lawyer, and I asked them both if they knew who Tourget was, and neither of them knew who he was, although they both knew the case. Apparently you have to study it. And I asked them both if they knew who Jackson was, and they didn't know who Jackson was either.
So sad.
Isn't that terrible? Now they do.
You have your work cut out for you.
But anyway, so all of this was all very interesting, and I'm telling it now as if I knew anything about it, and it's only because of doing this symposium and meeting people like Mark Elliott, who referred a remarkable woman named Carolyn Karcher, who's a professor emerita at Temple University in Philadelphia, lives in Washington. But between the two of them, they've made a career out of Tourget, Reconstruction, radical Republican politics in the time after the Civil War. In Karcher's case, she's very interested in women's issues and voting issues, minority issues. And so when Mark recommended her, he knew that she was going to bring balance to this program. He could deal with the legal issues because he really was focused on Plessy versus Ferguson, and she could deal basically with Tourget as a literary scholar. Tourget was a bestseller in the 1870s. His stuff was translated into half a dozen languages, and he made a fortune, millions of dollars, in today's dollars, which he then invested in a magazine called Our Continent, which was published in Philadelphia. It's it's around that time that he bought the house in Mayville, that beautiful Italian age, Victorian, with the tower. The idea was that they would spend their summers there, the Tourget family, and be prosperous in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, he had Cadillac taste and hired the best writers, the best illustrators. Oscar Wilde wrote for his magazine. He wouldn't accept advertising. It was beneath him. So anyway, he went bankrupt, which is a terrible story. And his poor wife, Emma, who basically had to just follow behind him and pick up the pieces, because he was an idealist. He was a radical idealist. So that's a term that Mark Eliot coined to describe Tourget. And when he says radical idealist, he's thinking about Tourget's childhood, growing his Protestant faith, his belief in justice, his belief in the golden rule, and do unto others as you'd have do unto you. And then his experience in the Civil War and his time spent down south is what really galvanized him. It was the first time he encountered slavery. And from then on, he was committed. He committed the rest of his life to equal rights at a time when he was almost alone. He certainly wasn't the only one. There were many others, but it would be hard to find anybody who spent so much time and literally most of his life doing this. Anyway, so at some point in the past, the Chautauqua County Historical Society was given the Tourget papers, over 11,000 items, including tons and tons of scrapbooks and letters. 6 presidents are in the collection. Countless letters to and from not only, what do I mean, the black literary elite at the time, the legal minds at the time, but also, you see barely literate letters saying, "Help me," and Tourget responded to all of these, and so it's an incredible archive. And so in putting the exhibit together, my challenge was, what do I select? What's important? And how do I display it? And that's why working with professionals like an author of Eliot's caliber really comes in handy. And that's why an organization like the New York Council of the Humanities is so important, because I couldn't do it on my own. My organization isn't funded. We're a nonprofit organization. We're membership driven. We don't receive county funds or state funds or federal funds. Occasionally, we'll be successful in grant writing, and it's always more work than the money you get. Somebody's shaking their head back there. They know, but it's well worth it. And so I don't know. The Chautauqua Region Community Foundation was a donor. They helped pay for some wonderful exhibit supplies that allowed us to do a first-class exhibit. I mentioned the Gladys Kreibel Delmas Foundation in Manhattan. They published this book and gave the author a stipend to produce it. And I think that, and Mark's biography basically is, it's wonderful. It's arranged chronologically. You get all the highlights. You understand why he's important from an historical perspective, but also what his underlying motivations were. And in writing this little brief biography, Eliot basically gave me the rhythm upon which to build an exhibit. Because it's not a large room, as you know, and we certainly couldn't cram 11,000 items into 5 or 6 display cases. So, working with Mark, we were able to select some very important things, including, I think it's a 46-page typewritten document that Tourget wrote. They are his oral notes for Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court at that time, I don't know, they didn't necessarily save records. I'm not exactly sure, but I know that these items have never been seen before. There was not a court recorder, present when he gave his oral argument, so there's no transcript anywhere of what he actually said. This is the only record of what he was thinking at the time. And what's really interesting about Plessy is Tourget was the first to bring the concept of colorblind justice as an expression, if nothing else, before the court. And also he argued that whiteness, being born with white skin, was a form of property that entitled some at the disadvantage of others, which is a profound thought, if you think about it. And so, I don't know, reading these things and learning all of this stuff was really an eye-opener for me, because it's not so much that I had assumptions that were challenged. There were things I never thought about that I suddenly was being given an opportunity to think about. It provided me with an opportunity to work with Carolyn and with Mark. Excellent. I really came to appreciate the role of scholarship, especially as it relates to an archive. Mark made the point that the only reason we know anything about Tourget is because of the Tourget papers. In a little building in Little Westfield, in Little Chautauqua County, and Tourget would have disappeared from history.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't have known nearly as much as we know, without them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really came to appreciate the scholars, and I also came to appreciate the collection. And of course, with that then is the responsibility for caring for them, and that's the real challenge that Joni and I face. Joni just received an IMLS grant. She talked about it during the question and answer period, or the archivist panel at the Tourget Symposium in October. I think it's over 30 years worth of items that have been donated to the Fenton History Center that fill something like 300 bankers' boxes that haven't been inventoried. And you might want to talk about that.
No.
It's kind of interesting. Well,
It's a lot. It's a lot.
What is IMLS?
Institute of Museum and Library Services. It's a federal arm, federal grant, and it's very generous to museums and libraries. And it's a 2-year grant, total of about $216,000, $96,000 of it coming from the government. The rest of it's all match, whether it's an in-kind for space or whether it's actual cash from someone. And it allows me to hire a couple archivists to work with our staff archivist and librarian to take all those boxes that we all have in our attics and basements and under the beds and in the closets and all those places and find out what's in those 400 cubic feet of boxes.
400 cubic
400,
feet.
yeah, from here to China. No, but it's 30 years of donations of archives, and they go all the way back, way back, way back, way.
Do you know what you're going to find in there?
Well, we found these posters about these big bands that came through the area in 1938. Every day Karen comes up with something very wonderful.
Who's Karen?
Who's Karen? Karen lives here as our librarian archivist. Fenton's been there over 20 years, and she's been itching to do this, designing this project for 20 years. So when I said, I think I found the right way to do it, and I might have the skills now to write this grant, she said, let's do it. So it's very exciting. We're finding many wonderful things. The trouble is we're going to have to create a number of artificial collections because people bring collections in, and sometimes it looks like someone took the kitchen junk drawer and just dumped it. But parts of it are important, and how it is in there is important. So there's a lot of work that goes on with these.
That's how Andy
big
Warhol
collections.
archived his things.
Oh, he just put them in boxes, taped them up, and put a date on
Do you
them.
know why he did it, though?
Because he didn't want to deal with the mail.
No, it was the IRS.
Yeah, well, he didn't want to deal with them either.
They called him up for an audit, and then he was so panicked because he couldn't produce receipts that he saved every receipt.
Yeah.
And he would just have the people throw everything into a box, and then he'd put a date on it.
And the Andy Warhol
I
Museum
know.
in Pittsburgh has them all. And they got an IMLS grant to deal with it.
Did they really?
Yes, they did.
Did they really?
Anyway, sorry, we digress.
Well, but fundamentally, there is a question, and at some point, Mrs. Tourget, the heirs of the Tourget, decided to deliver that to a museum. And they had to bring boxes and boxes of stuff, and somebody had to go through the cognitive process of deciding whether or not to accept. how does-
Those boxes were in the attic in the house in Maine.
But just generally, but how do you gatekeep?
As far as the Tourget collection is concerned, I think that we are not exactly sure. I'm certainly not because I haven't been there that long. But there is no record, that tells us how this collection came to us. I do know that the Tourget home is right next door to the Mayville Library. The land for the library was donated by Emma Tourget to the Tuesday Club. Anybody familiar with Tuesday Club? Any Tuesday Club members? There's one. Hi. Emma Tourget was a member of Tuesday Club, and Tuesday Club was a ladies' literary group, and they would meet every Tuesday. and it was they who advocated for a library in Mayville. And when Emma died, I think the Tourget collection wound up in the hands of the Tuesday Club, who at some point turned to their neighbors. At this point, the Chautauqua County Historical Society was located in Mayville, in the old court, right across the street from the courthouse, in that little building, little brick building.
Mm-hmm.
So, and at that point, there weren't accepted museum, practices that were being followed. They hadn't clearly been delineated for
There are lots of
small
places
historical
that don't do it now.
societies. Well, and when you consider that the Chautauqua County Historical Society was founded in 1883, it's an old, venerable organization. It was founded actually by the sons and grandsons of the pioneers, and they were motivated to save their own family histories, which is kind of interesting. And so for years and years and years, they would do research into their communities. They'd write original papers, and they would present them to each other, over meals in their own homes. So some of that tradition still lives on, because we do have 4 meetings every spring, summer, and fall. But anyway, so I think at some point, all of this stuff, all the Tourget things that were just stuck in boxes and came to the Historical Society, where it was, just was, stuck in an attic room until a man named Otto Olson, I believe it was doing research and found the papers. And he describes in his foreword the conditions they were in, little mouse chewing on the edge of the pages.
Yeah.
And then there was a man whose name, I'm sorry, I can't recall, but he was from northern Ohio. He was from Ashtabula County, and he taught at Kent State University. And it was he who got a large grant from some agency to do the inventory of the Tourget collection. So now it's all properly cared for. It's all indexed. It's all chronological in order. And it's something like, I don't know how many boxes, 30 boxes, 60 reels of microfilm. And that's just the paperwork. That's just the archives portion of it. We also have furniture. We also have Confederate script and small weaponry and family photos. There's an awful lot that really rounds out the collection so you get an idea. And as Mark says somewhere, I think it's on the website, if it weren't for their meticulous record keeping, this collection wouldn't have been able to have been saved. I mean, if they hadn't amassed it and taken care of it and husbanded it as well as they did, they couldn't have turned it over to anybody. So that was sort of terrific. I had the wonderful opportunity over the weekend to see the Tourget conference on the internet. There's a group in Northeast Pennsylvania, David and Lisa Gensimer is their name, and they own a company called Main Street Media, and they make documentary films for PBS and others. And we hired them with some of the money that we got from the Council for the Humanities to document the entire day's event. And they did a wonderful job, and they edited down, I don't know, I guess it was 60 minutes worth of video with Mark and with Carolyn into a lovely 12-minute little video that you can see when you go online. And I can give you, anybody interested in the address, it's really funny sounding. It's
Actually, for those who did not open up their grapevine today,
Is it in there?
I gave it to Jane, and she sent it around. So if you don't have the grapevine, then you can see Jane.
Well, it's just Tourget-justicedeferred.blogspot.com. It's the blogspot.com that gets me. Not sure what it means, but anyway. But the entire conference is there, and including they're called audio podcasts, and you can listen right from your computer. Your presentation is there in its entirety. Mark's presentation in its entirety. Karcher's the archivist panel. John Schmitz is going to be speaking to this group in a couple of weeks. That man's astonishing. He's the archivist for the Oliver Archives at Chautauqua Institution. He comes from Canada. He may be the most qualified archivist in Chautauqua County. And during his portion of that panel discussion, it was as if he was dictating a book off the top of his head. I couldn't believe it. And one thing that stands out, he's talking about problems that archives face, or archivists face, including moisture, which can lead to mold, which can lead to degradation of collections, and things like sunlight, and all of the problems, humidity control. And he said, but you don't have a problem with fire. If you have a fire, you don't have a problem. I mean, it was awfully funny.
Yeah.
Perish the thought.
It's a new category.
Yeah.
He doesn't strike you as a worrywart.
No, but anyway, so what was really amazing about the day was bringing all of this talent. Heidi Bamford came down from the Western New York Library Resources Council, and she prepared a lesson plan, for school teachers to use based on Tourget and the civil rights case.
Heidi is the Documentary Heritage Program officer for this part of the state from New York State, and she just finished her master's degree in secondary education as well. So everything she does has an education perspective to it. She boils everything down to the best way to get it across to someone else.
Well, she made the point, though, that day that the primary source materials are not being used in the classroom. Right. They're available in almost every community. Chautauqua County is especially rich, in things that teachers could use. There's something called DBQs, document-based questions.
Yes.
Have you ever?
Yes,
you're familiar with them. Okay. Well, we didn't have them when I was in school.
No, I didn't.
And but apparently, the students are given a document, and this is probably part of Regents exams, and they're supposed to evaluate what they see. But if they don't have a context, if they don't have familiarity, if they don't have an opportunity to discuss the meaning, or even to the time to become familiar with the content, of these documents, how can they possibly say anything intelligent about them? It's not fair. It's not fair to make them take a test, throw something at them. They're doomed. They're set up to fail. I mean, teachers really should, pay more attention to local resources. I think it's difficult for them. I understand. It's a world apart. They have their own challenges. But
Anecdotally, Jamestown Public Schools has a very extensive website available to teachers and others about primary documents.
mm-hmm.
From maps to letters to diaries to ledgers, everything's there. Pam Brown has scanned so many things, thousands of documents, and the teachers can use those.
Can use them, but will they?
Well, it's up to a teacher's interest whether they do it or not, and whether they know how to do it.
Well, I had there were 3 young ladies that were in high school and close to graduating. They were visiting an exhibit that we have at the museum called The Lincoln Legacy, Chautauqua County Connections to the Great Emancipator. And part of the exhibit featured a nice photograph of Horace Greeley. And as part of my tour, as you pointed out, so I pointed out to these three girls, how there's Horace Greeley. Have you heard of Horace Greeley? And I just got this blank expression. They'd never heard of him, and which sort of surprised me. And I said, "Go west, young man." And, if you ever heard, "Go west, young man," because when Horace Greeley said that, he was talking about Chautauqua County. He was talking about Erie County, Pennsylvania. We were the frontier at the time, and blank expression. They'd never heard of that. And I said, "Manifest Destiny, have you heard of that?" And so my point, they hadn't heard of it. My point is they're not teaching American history. And I don't know, they're not teaching all of it anyway. And I just said they're going to drop the War of 1812 from the New York State Standard. Which, that's the...
War of 1812.
War of 1812, which, established the boundaries for the United States. I don't know. I hope you'll edit this portion out before you release it.
Sure. What did you learn about Albion Tourget during the course of the symposium that you didn't know?
About everything, practically.
Everything you just said.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I can sum it up, really. I mean, Tourget was one of the most important, white voices arguing on behalf of black rights in the last half, in the middle to the last half of the 19th century. He died in 1905. And, I didn't know that. He gave the primary eulogy for Frederick Douglass in Boston. He was invited by the family to do that. I didn't know that. He started the first, what would you call it, civil rights organization with a mixed race component in the country in the 1890s, 1891. I didn't know that. There's so much about Tourget. There's so many reasons, to know about him, and so certainly all of that stuff was very interesting. What he did, why he did it is just as interesting. It's that religious conviction, which is impelled by a force of character, what Mark calls a radical idealist, or whatever he called him. He was willing to act. It's been so interesting. Risk his life. He would get death threats from Ku Klux Klan members. His wife would get letters saying, "Tell your husband not to come home." He didn't flinch. He didn't leave. He didn't run from North Carolina. He stayed there. God help the man that stood up to him. He had one eye. Did you know that? He was blind in one eye. He lost an eye in an accident on the farm in Ohio, but he told everybody it happened during the Civil War.
Yeah.
I love that. And when he died in 1905, he was consul of France, and he died as a result of an infection from a piece of shrapnel that he received during the Civil War. So, in a sense, he was a Civil War casualty, even in 1905.
What about his relationship to Chautauqua Institution? What did you learn about that?
Quite a lot. He came to Chautauqua, we think, because he was familiar with Erie. He lived in Erie, Pennsylvania for a while. He was head of the Erie Academy, so he would have been familiar with this area. And he came through and saw it, liked it. It was growing as a resort community in the 1870s. Chautauqua Institution had already started. It was fledgling, but he was a frequent speaker. But one of the things I discovered in the archive is a series of newspaper reviews of Chautauqua programming that were written by his daughter, Amy Tourget, and published in the Mayville papers. So, it's a wonderful whole series of, things that happened right here, at a certain period of time. I haven't even talked about Amy. They only had one child. I mean, I mentioned that they'd adopted an ex-slave girl and gave her an education. And then when Amy was born, their only natural child, and grew to, about the age when she would have been, entering school, that's when Emma had it. Because people were, the white people in North Carolina were so, mean to them. They wouldn't let them go to church, or, there were real problems. And she just told Albion, I'm not raising my daughter. She won't get an education. They won't let her. And so she came back to Erie, and that's basically how the family, wound up in this area. And I don't know what I was talking about to you.
What happened, Amy?
The institution.
The institution.
Yeah.
Oh, before you lose Amy, what happened to her?
Well, Amy died before Albion died, which is sad. So she never married, and she had no children. What's interesting about Amy, aside from her great good looks, was that she was an extremely talented artist. And we have many of her pieces in the collection, including oil paintings that are absolutely beautiful. One of them is on exhibit. I think there are two pieces that we have in the exhibit. One of them is an India ink drawing of Tourget and two compatriots in Civil War uniform standing in front of a tent, which is based on a photograph. And as a graphic artist myself, I can tell you she was highly skilled. He encouraged her to have an independent career. I mean, her father did, Albion did. Unusual at the time. And there was no pressure on her from her parents to marry, and have children. She died of a heart condition, apparently, which is too bad. So Albion died in 1905, and then Emma came home, brought his ashes. He's interred at Mayville Cemetery under the obelisk that you mentioned earlier. So it's sad. She was all alone at the end of her life. She had a sister, but I don't know if the sister lived nearby.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so thank God for Tuesday Club. They were family to her, or a substitute family.
When did they buy the house in Mayville?
I'm going to guess, I have the date. In fact, it's in your booklet.
Approximately.
It's in your booklet on page. I don't have my glasses, so Joni's going to have to read it to you. What does that say? 1881.
What she said, 1881.
1881.
I did 1905.
1905. So he lived here during Plessy versus Ferguson, and he was corresponding by mail with what is it? The Citizens Committee. It was in New Orleans. The Citizens Committee to challenge the Separate Car Act. And does anybody know? Any lawyers here know the Plessy case? Anyway, so
There's lawyers here.
Yeah. You really don't want us to get going, do you?
yeah. Well, actually, it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, they're boo. But I think one of the interesting is Homer Plessy was only 1/8 black.
Right.
I mean, so they really selected. They spent a lot of time selecting their plaintiff, which is not uncommon in that world, but that clearly was the backdrop of it.
The whole point was to challenge the law.
Absolutely. And it was, frankly, the arrest, everything else was very civilly done and set up and well documented so they could prepare the case and challenge it accordingly.
That's right. In fact, we have Tourget's brief that he prepared with a lawyer in New Orleans, for the Louisiana court. which is an earlier document. They lost that case, obviously, and then it went to the Supreme Court where they lost it again. But it's interesting to compare the two legal briefs.
What was the reference to property, whiteness being a property?
Yeah, it's a form of property. White skin. If you're born white, you're enfranchised. If you're not white, you have a struggle. Then that was.
Entitlements if you're
That's
white.
right.
Are you
That's
saying
right.
that it became defined as such in the law, or?
No, it was
It's an observation?
It's an observation. What it was, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was a legal device that Tourget was bringing to the court, and he was trying to.
Oh, he said that.
It was Tourget who basically said, he was making that point that,
Oh.
that it was a form of property, and as right, then then it becomes a property right. And what exactly does he say? That if you were a black lawyer, for instance, what choice what would that do to your career? Who's going to given a choice?
It was a novel idea. He tried it. It didn't get a lot of stories.
Well, it's interesting with Justice Jackson. I mean, that's how we open this booklet. Jackson.
Oh, really? What page is that?
Well, because we either you have the letter or we have a copy of the letter. I'm not exactly sure, but Jackson was from the Jamestown area, from Shrewsbury, I think is where he grew up, and. Anyway, when he's in Washington, he stumbles across.
This is the guy that's putting together the exhibit at the Jackson Center on the biography.
We have a choice.
Yeah.
We have Spring Creek, we have Shrewsbury, we have choices.
No, but anyway,
Go ahead.
just that,
You
that
were
Jackson
right.
Jackson came across Tourget's legal brief in Washington, and of course he knew about a writer, a famous writer in the Mayville area named Tourget. Could there be two Albion Tourgets? It's just, and of course there aren't. There's just one. And so people who knew about the writer didn't know about the lawyer. People who knew about the lawyer didn't know about the writer. It's just sort of interesting that in this exhibit and with this symposium, we were able to bring two scholars together. To bring these. And imagine being a successful author and a successful writer. Who else? Michael Crichton is the only person I could think of.
Until he starts.
Well, what is interesting is the fact that this exhibit, or the museum, was used as a resource in 1949, 1950, 51 by Jackson as he was preparing for what ultimately became the Brown versus Board case. He had two of his lawyer friends actually go up, gather information, send it down, because he wanted to learn exactly as you said. So that correspondence with Ernie Calcroft and Sam Edson exists, which is really eye-opening.
That is interesting.
Because they saw Jackson knew this case, these series of cases were going to fly through the Supreme Court, and he wanted some more background. And to me, what I find fascinating is the bookends of the civil rights, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board. You got Albion Tourget, you got Robert Jackson. They're both from Chautauqua County, and really, that's sort of a story unto itself, which is.
It's coincidental.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting, Mark Elliott makes the point in his talk about post-Civil War. The radical Republicans were forcing through an agenda at the time, and it lost steam. There were political decisions that were made that I can't even say it abbreviated. It ended any progress that the blacks were able to make. As freedmen. And then followed Jim Crow. In my lifetime, the civil rights movement in the 60s, I was 10 years old in 1960, so I'm aware of it. I saw it covered on television. It was part of my life. And there was all this hope, all this enthusiasm. And then with the 1970s, what happened to all that? When I was at Rhode Island School of Design, it was, the late 60s, it was an impassioned community. The students were activists. They were, and then by the early 1970s, the whole thing had dropped. It all became about fashion. It all became about, Cartier tank watches. It was, very interesting. So, and so there's a similarity between, post-Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. This great movement, and then there's a pause. Then, so maybe it's just like this one, rhythm that happens. And that's maybe what it means to be progressive. You're ahead of your time. It takes people. I went to see a wonderful exhibit at the Albright Knox over the weekend called Action Abstraction. Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. which is much more my bailiwick than the Supreme Court. But I saw all these really interesting, similarities. The show basically talks about two, Rosenberg, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but they were two art critics in New York City that were very influential in the 50s. And they created abstract expressionism, simply by defining it, what these mad artists were doing, like Jackson Pollock and others. They created a rationale, out of whole cloth. They just invented it like a lawyer does when he goes in front of a judge. And anyway, so what's really interesting...
She said with great respect.
Well, so we were talking about the penumbra of the Constitution. But anyway, the part of the exhibit, a major part of the exhibit, is ephemera. It's their newspaper reviews, by these critics. There are also exhibition catalogs. There are also Life magazine covers. This is art. Mad magazine that featured a painting by a chimpanzee and compared it with a Pollock. So all of that material comes from an archive, and it serves to explain the paintings on the walls in a way that I found it extremely valuable. A lot of museums don't save paper, because there's acid in it, and it degrades, and you can't keep it forever. And yet, the power of paper to communicate, whatever activities, movements, things that happened. Anyway, go see the show. It's up until I think the end of March or maybe April.
What would you do differently with the show now that it's done? In essence, it's running its course.
I would have I would have been much more aggressive in terms of raising advertising dollars, because not enough people heard about the show. We only had 50 people out of a potential audience of 200. That's 25%. That was, considering the amount of time that I put into it, and I know other people did. That's a poor turnout. Thank God for that we decided to videotape it and to edit it and upload everything to the internet, because the entire conference is available online. Mm-hmm. So we've lost nothing. Which is kind of freaky. Things never end. In this digital age. So that's the only thing I would do. I would promote it more heavily, because everything else I think was perfect. Note perfect. Yeah, and the speakers couldn't have been more qualified. They couldn't have been. The questions were absolutely terrific. Those of you who were in the audience, I'm sure you appreciated it too. And the only other thing I would have done was I would have printed out the questionnaire that we developed to gauge audience response. I wouldn't have printed it on the back of the schedule because nobody saw it. Anyway, well.
It is a terrific exhibit, and I commend the work that both of you did, and James to have the vision of taking Tourget, because clearly, but for this exercise, he would have continued to have been just a footnote in local history. Yeah. This this does not have a shelf life.
James was the brains. I was the brawn, but he was the brains of this operation for the exhibit. It really was.
Well, it was the Historical Society's exhibit, but we partnered with the Jackson Center. We partnered with the Fenton. I was asking for things, that I believe in collaboration. I think when we work together, we're all much stronger than we are when working independently. And we may have an old organization, but we're dirt poor, and we don't have. And this is a sparsely populated, county, and it's very difficult. You asked me a question. The most significant thing that I got out of this is the value of the collection and the need to preserve it. Literally, Mark and Carolyn, through their participation, what they showed me about the value that they found not only in Tourget's life, but also how they know anything about Tourget's life, which is the collection, through the collection. So that burden, they've laid that right at our feet. Here it is. Here's why it's important. Now save it. Mm-hmm. So that's the challenge. That's why I'm here tonight. To let you know.
Are they members of the society yet?
Who?
Are they members of the society?
Oh, are you members of the society?
No.
Oh.
Well, yes, that's important.
Yeah.
I was thinking of
Mark and Carolyn. They're on the mailing list.
Oh,
they're
good.
honorary members.
Again, back to the selection process. Are there individuals other than Tourget that's in your collection that is yet to be?
John Oliver Bowman. If anybody ever heard of John Bowman? Yeah. Anybody else? You have. John Bowman was a remarkable man. He was born in the late 1800s and died in the 1970s. So he was quite old. He was a county clerk in Mayville for 1,000,000 years, and he was also a photographer. He was an amateur photographer who took the most beautiful photographs with a Brownie camera. And he submitted his photographs for publication. Collier's magazine in the 1940s, I think, called him the king of the box camera of the universe, something like that. I worked for American Greetings. That was where my professional career was spent, and part of that was in the photography department. So I know a lot about composition and the value of photographs. And his stuff is sublime. I mean, they're all black and white. They're all small scale, but without flashes, without digital anything, without just a box camera composing. Getting putting a red filter on and capturing that incredible cloud. And so what it is, we have over 8,000 prints and negatives in the collection. He was a member, he was a curator at the McClurg Museum. And that's a collection that's waiting to be explored, explained, and I'm even going to say exploited. We had a young woman whose name, I'm sorry, escapes me, but she wrote her dissertation a year ago or 2 years ago on Bowman. She was a fine arts major, I think she was majoring in art history, and she chose Bowman because of the Chautauqua County connections. Her grandfather was from Jamestown. So she wrote this wonderful piece in which she compared Bowman's work with Paul Strand and other major photographers of the early 20th century, and he very favorably. And this is I'm not going to say he's illiterate, but he was untrained. He didn't have an agent. He didn't have gallery representation. And what he was able to achieve with that little camera is astonishing. I could do a coffee table book. I would love to do that. That's who's going to do all this? There's so many ideas.
How's that collection preserved?
It's all chronological. It's all in acid-free acetate sleeves. When Michelle Henry, the county historian, worked for the Historical Society, she got a grant and preserved that collection. But nobody knows about it, and I don't. A collection that isn't accessed isn't. What's the point of having it? If people don't know about it. And the reason I chose Tourget to do an exhibit in the first place is because I was trying to draw attention to the plight that agencies like mine, small historical societies, even smaller than ours, the little ones in Sherman, the Yorker Museum, what am I thinking of, Sinclairville, Historical Society. They have incredible collections of things, and they're even more discreet, because it's very much local history. But they don't have staff, they don't have budgets, they don't have the proper training, they don't know procedures to preserve and protect. And so I wanted to focus attention on archives issues. And I thought, well, choose a collection that has broad appeal. And if civil rights doesn't appeal to everyone, then there's something wrong with everyone. So that's why I chose Tourget. That was the rationale. What I got out of it was a deeper understanding of Tourget, but the underlying principle or the underlying purpose for my doing it still stands, and that's, we have these collections. We're mostly volunteers. We need community support, to protect what isn't. This isn't our property. It belongs to the people of the state of New York. Yeah. And but we don't receive funds from the state of New York, unless you jump through hoops. Libraries
Not
are.
this year.
I know, next year. But the point I want to make is that that public libraries are chartered by the Board of Regents, and so are historical societies. Public libraries are endowed. They get funds from from the state. Historical societies, which have the same reporting requirements as libraries, an annual report that has to be filed, gets no funding. Yeah. So I don't know. It's not fair. And Ann Ackerson from the Museum Association of New York and other advocates for fairness are trying to approach the issue, but obviously it's so minor that good luck. Go pick flowers.
Joni, what's personality that is yet to be explored out of your...
I knew you were going to ask me that, and this is where I have to say I honestly don't know, because I have the luxury of having a staff that has an idea list that they keep going all the time, a hot list of what they want to talk about. And so I go to them and talk to them about what they want to do. And I end up doing many of the exhibits because I'm the salaried person. And exhibits take hours, 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 and hours. So that's why I'm pals with James, because he's the designer.
I love exhibits.
Oh, yes. That's why I love him. So I honestly can't tell you what, we have so many personalities in Jamestown that we could do something about. And I know this is a golden moment to bring up one of them, but it's hard to pick one.
Fenton is the one I'd like to see explored. And
We do need to push,
more deeply
duh,
understood.
we do need to push Reuben Fenton much more. But there are a lot of them.
Well, what was it, the Kansas-Nebraska bill that was
Yeah,
brought
in
up?
1854.
Mhm. And he gave the first speech in the Congress against
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And that was one of the, the explosive points for the Civil War. And nobody really knows what, Kansas-Nebraska means, why it's a trigger, what Fenton's role in it was, Lincoln's connection to Fenton, and to other issues.
And we will be exploring those much more over the next few years when we start to reinterpret the museum. We've raised some capital dollars, and we can start to go through the Fenton Mansion and make it a much more easy museum to go through and learn things about Chautauqua County. Because it's not been put together quite right.
Are you
at
going
this
to try to put together a monograph on Fenton?
Yes, we'll do something much more than what we have. We will have an orientation room, we will make use of video. We'll have a lot more. So we have people who come in and they see that it says museum on the sign, and the house looks old, and gee, there must be something here. And that's all they know when they walk in. They have no idea who Reuben Fenton is. And most people don't, even going through school now in Chautauqua County, they come out not knowing, well, they're not going to know about the War of 1812 either, according to you. But Fenton was very important in for our county. Being out here in the sticks and having him be very important in the Republican Party in New York State, very important.
Segue, what was the name of the individual who gave a speech, and I think it was 2002 at the Lincoln Days in Westfield, of which you guys were a part, and he talked about the beginning of the Republican Party here in Chautauqua.
Yeah, Doug Haug. Yeah.
Doug, where's he from?
Well, he's from Mayville, and he lives in Westfield, and he also lives in Punta Gorda, Florida. And he teaches English and creative writing at Edison College in Punta Gorda. And he's from Arkwright. His family were pioneers, early settlers. He's a wonderful man. Has incredible enthusiasm for local history. He loves to research. In fact, he's just completed the text for a book that the Historical Society and the Fenton are co-producing. It's a history of Chautauqua County that'll be out this year. And but he's terrific. What, do you want to talk to him?
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
I'd love to.
'cause he's
but
great.
he spoke, that's a long story, but anyways, I was part of that
That's right.
program, and that was our first introduction to Kent Brown, which led to, it's a long story, led to Gail Jarrett.
Right.
Was there at your event.
Right.
But I remember, most people don't know that certainly there is an argument to be made that the Republican Party, as we know it today, started here in Mayville, New York.
1855.
And so it's kind of a fascinating... Pardon?
That is fact.
It is fact, yeah. But
Well,
Greg,
you're going to have to argue with Ripken, Wisconsin, and
Yeah.
you're going to have to
Yeah, yeah.
argue with
Yeah.
Jackson,
yeah.
Mississippi.
But the point is that they did establish at that meeting in Mayville in 1855 what was going to be on the platform,
Yes.
which was held in Pittsburgh the following year. But here's the most amazing coincidence. The Chautauqua County Historical Society is housed in the McClurg Museum. The house was built in 1820 by James McClurg, who was the son of a Pittsburgh industrialist who was born in Ireland. James came here basically to seek his fortune, which he did amply. But his brother, Alexander, I think it is, remained in Pittsburgh and stayed with the family foundry and became rich and famous. In 1856, when the Republicans, having met in Mayville, held their convention in Pittsburgh, they held their convention in James McClurg's brother's building.
Really?
What do you think of that?
Wow, 6 degrees.
Well, it's kind of interesting, it's here we are in River City, and
I know.
that's a story, but the first time I'd ever heard it.
Well, the word is there were 1,000 people in attendance at that meeting in Mayville.
But Jack, do you know why
There
they
are
came
two-
here? Do you know why they came here? They came to avoid the prying eyes of the press in Albany. That's why, because
The American people-
William Seward was familiar with Chautauqua County, so was Fenton,
Yeah.
so was Horace Greeley, George Patterson, a lot of,
There are two accounts of that meeting. The Jamestown paper says there were 100 people there.
misprint.
No, American paper, American Party.
That's right.
But the two, it's interesting, because I had to research that, because I did an exhibit on the formation of the Republican Party in Chautauqua. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That'd be-
Now I know that.
There's a rumor that Abraham Lincoln spent time in Westfield. After Cooper Union, there's a 2 or 3 week period of time when he can't be accounted for. So he disappears to New York. He visits his son in New England where he's in school. Then nobody knows where he is, and then he's in Springfield. And there's a family tradition. Austin Smith, whose son, somehow his daughter marries into the Tennant family, but it becomes known as the Tennant Smith house. And in their family, there's local legend that Abraham Lincoln slept there. And they'll even point to the bed and say that's it. And so anyway, somebody has to prove them wrong.
This is terrific, kids.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's
Great.
been
What
fun.
an insightful
Well, we're all going out for dinner. Do you want to join us?
webs.
One
Thank-
important detail of your McClurg,
Mm-hmm.
when he came here, he bought the first property from the 6 Dutchmen from Batavia
Mm-hmm.
province, Amsterdam,
Mhm.
and they signed the deed. It wasn't called Holland Land Company
No,
yet.
no.
No.
All
That's
the
right.
names, Willink,
Mm-hmm.
Staphorst, Van Hoven, all signed the
Yeah.
deed. Now, the next purchase was part of that land was sold to Eason.
That's right. David Eason.
Part of that 100+ acres was sold to Eason.
And Eason sold too.
And that included the McClurg, the land the Presbyterian church is on, which he gave to the church, where the Episcopal church is, which he gave to that church, Patterson Library.
Mhm.
All of these properties
Yeah.
were in that first deed,
Now,
and I have a copy of it.
your church, St. Peter's Episcopal, which was given, you just mentioned it, but that's where William Seward was baptized and confirmed. Did you know that?
That is
And in a letter he wrote
And
to
he
his
gave
wife,
$25 for the first organ we had.
but in a letter to his wife, he's talking about the fact that he gets baptized, and he says that he felt he should, which seems like a pretty good reason to get baptized.
Okay, can you beat that?
I thought you.
Seward is an interesting character. So we really should do more about him. Somebody described him, this is hysterical, you'll love it, standing on the floor of the House or the Senate, wherever it was, but in an orange suit, white tie, big whatever, with a big green silk scarf. He took snuff and sneezed. He had a big nose, sneezing into this thing. Somebody described him, and shocking red hair. He had red hair when he was young, but they described him as looking just like a parrot. Doesn't that sound funny?
Well, see, that is a piece of the puzzle. You go by, you see the Seward Inn, you see certain pieces of the puzzle, but virtually nobody knows much of the story.
Yeah, I know.